What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to the 2 Feet on the Ground Gravity Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Chris. Thank you for choosing to tune in today. Folks, I am excited about today's interview. I had the opportunity to interview accomplished author and investigative reporter Pete Earley. Just a remarkable interview, and he's going to give us some powerful insights of how we can do a better job as a society of approaching this conversation of mental health. But before we get into that, I wanted to give you the backstory a little bit. It was about 3 months ago. I'm in a conversation with a friend, Kittitas Police Department Chief Aaron Nelson, and he says, "Hey, Chris, I got to recommend a book to you. It's titled Crazy, A Father's Search Through America's Mental Health Madness, and it's by this guy named Pete Earley." And I was like, all right, I get a lot of books recommended to me. Why this one? And he goes, "Chris, this book's so powerful. This book is such a game changer that I purchased it for all my officers and I asked them to read it. Because I really believe it's going to change the game and change our mindset and how we approach mental health and how we provide public safety service." Well, that was a pretty powerful recommendation for me. So I purchased it on Amazon. I went and planted myself at a Starbucks, and I didn't even get through the preface. I'm in the first 3 pages of this book, and it hooked me. I was like, holy smokes, this author is going to get very transparent and vulnerable about what happened to him and his family, and it's going to help me as a police officer. I reached out to the author, Pete Earley, and I said, "Sir, I'm just starting your book. This is a great work. Can I please interview you? I think you have something to say to people like me and helping us approach this conversation." And he said, yes. And that's what today's interview is going to be. We're going to get into that here in just a second. But before we do that, I wanted to talk about an organization that's making a difference for law enforcement officers. It's titled the Behind the Badge Foundation. They've been around for over a couple decades here in Washington State, taking care of police officers and their families. Something that they've been doing more recently here is organizing training conferences for law enforcement officers and their families, and they're doing it completely free of charge for the conference attendees. That's right, they're bringing in just remarkable speakers and resources for the family unit, and they're putting on the entire conference free of charge. You got to check them out today. If you're a law enforcement officer or the family member, a spouse of a law enforcement officer, go to behindthebadgefoundation.org. Check it out down in the notes of this podcast. You gotta consider coming out here to Kennewick, Washington, and attending this event. It's going to be a great opportunity for us to get better at taking care of ourselves, taking care of our families, so that we're healthy to go out there and take care of the public. With that, let's jump into this interview with Pete Earley. Pete Earley, thanks for joining me here on the Gravity Podcast.
It's my pleasure. Happy to talk to you.
The listeners don't know this, but you and I have been monkeying around with technology for about the last half hour. But right now, I feel like we have conquered this.
Yes, there you go.
Hey, in the intro, I've already introduced a little bit about you, but I was hoping that you could just draw a better picture for the listeners, setting the stage. 2005, 2006, you're an accomplished investigative journalist, author. Things are going relatively well for you and your family. Your son's about to graduate college, and all of a sudden, life takes this nasty turn. And can you just set that stage so the listeners can understand kind of what started you writing this book titled Crazy?
Sure, Chris. And it was just came out of the blue. My story really begins with kind of a frantic car ride. I had raced to New York to get my son. I had found him. He was a student at the Pratt Institute, as you said, about ready to graduate. I found him wandering around the city for 5 days. He'd barely slept. He'd hardly eaten. He was convinced God had him on this secret message. And during that frantic car ride, he would laugh one minute and then begin sobbing the next. And he said, "Dad, how would you feel if someone you loved killed himself?" Now, a year earlier, he'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and a psychiatrist had given him medication, but he'd stopped taking his pills. And I pleaded with him to take his medication, take those pills, and he screamed, "Pills are poison, leave me alone." So we got to an emergency room because I didn't know where else to go. And we were taken immediately by a nurse who was rolling her eyes while he talked gibberish into a separate room. And we sat there and we sat there and we sat there. And after 4 hours, Kevin said, I'm done. I want to leave. There's nothing wrong with me. And I raced out and I literally grabbed a doctor. And I'll never forget, he came in with his hands up as if he was surrendering. And he said, I can't do anything to help your son. I said, you haven't even examined him. He explained that it didn't matter. Virginia, like most states, required someone to be in an imminent, immediate danger to themselves or others before they could be required to get any kind of treatment. And the nurse had told him that my son thought all pills were poison. And the fact we'd been sitting there for 4 hours showed there was no danger. So he said to me, look, you seem like a concerned dad. Bring him back after he tries to hurt you or someone else. I couldn't believe that. And Kevin raced out of the hospital. 48 hours later, I took him home, and I got to, he's sitting there in front of a TV with tinfoil wrapped around his head to keep the CIA from reading his thoughts. And I'm thinking, what is wrong? Why can't I get him help? Well, he slipped out of the house early one morning. He slipped out and broke into a stranger's house. Luckily, no one was there. It took 5 police officers and a attack dog to get him out. He was in taking a bubble bath to wash away his sins. And at that moment, my son became one of the 2.2 million people with mental illnesses who are booked into jail every year. One of the 365,000 who are sitting in jails and prisons. And I later learned that I was darn lucky because the homeowners told me they had a gun next to their bed. My son had thrown a chair through their patio window door to get inside, and they undoubtedly would have shot him breaking into their house. I didn't understand it, Chris, because Virginia law had kept me from getting him help when he obviously was psychotic and needed help, and now wanted to punish him for a crime he committed when he wasn't thinking clearly. That's what started me on this journey. I ended up deciding to go into jails and prisons to see how people with mental illness were being treated and why they were ending up there.
Now this role as an investigative journalist of you getting an all access pass to jails or prisons wasn't new. You had previously written the book Hot House, and you had full access to Leavenworth prison. I mean, so you had that picture, but this is different. This is different. When you're, as an investigator, as a journalist, when you're telling a story, when you're putting a spotlight on something, that's one thing. But when this involves your family, when this involves your son,
you are so right on. Yeah, I was fortunate in that I convinced the Bureau of Prisons to let me spend a year inside a maximum security penitentiary as a reporter, just wandering around talking to people. But there was that disconnect. I was talking to people who were in gangs and things. They weren't my family. This hit home. I first started at the Los Angeles County Jail, and they lasted 2 weeks before they threw me out, saying I was violating Hipaa. They just didn't want me seeing the overcrowding and the awful condition. I tried Rikers Island next. They said no. I tried Chicago next. They said no. I tried Baltimore. They said no. I tried Washington, D.C., my hometown. They said hell no. And I finally got in to the Miami-Dade jail, and the 9th floor there, it was unbelievable. I remember literally having to leave in tears because I looked under a bunk in one of these cells, and there was this guy curled up eating orange peels in a cell built for 2. There were 6 people. And I thought, is this my son's future? Is this what's going to happen to him? And we know that people with bipolar disorder, 40% of them will have a serious encounter with the police. They're 16 times more likely to be spend time in jail longer than anyone else charged with the same crime. And up to 42% of police shootings, fatal shootings, involve someone who's in a mental health crisis. So it's very, this interaction between law enforcement and people with mental illness is a very, very serious and deadly thing. And that's, I decided, first, we got to understand why people are ending up in jails and prisons, why they're encountering the police, and then what can we do about it? And it's also, It's also difficult for police officers. We know that more police officers end their own life than are shot while on duty. So this mental health thing just isn't a one-way street. We got to find a better way for officers to deal with mental health, and we sure as heck have to find a better way to stop people with mental health problems having these serious encounters with law enforcement.
What got us here? I know you detail this in your book, Crazy, but what got us here as a country to where we don't have a better solution as a society to help people in mental health crisis?
Well, it goes way, way, way back. In fact, we've kind of come full circle. When this country was first founded, people with mental illness were either taken care of by their family, they were locked up in jails, or they were taken by the sheriff to the county line and told, get walking and never come back, just get out of here. In the 1800s, Dorothea Dix came along, and she was teaching a Sunday school lesson in a Boston jail, and she went through part of the jail, and it didn't have any heat. People were literally freezing. And she went to the jailer and said, you can't treat people this way. And he goes, oh, those are the lunatics. They don't feel the cold. They're not like you and me. And she began lobbying for the creation of state mental hospitals. And during a 2-decade period, she got almost every state to create these hospitals, which were supposed to be compassionate places. Well, we didn't know how to really help people with mental illnesses. There were a lot of quack cures. People were being dumped there. They were ending up, and we all know by the 1960s, a lot of these places had turned into horrific warehouses where people were just locked up and forgotten and abandoned. In my book, I describe one in Florida. Now, this is the 1980s, mind you, where the patients were stripped naked, not allowed to wear clothes, not giving toilet paper, had toothbrushes, communal toothbrushes, and literally had to fight for clothes every morning when they'd bring them in. And neighbors complained about seeing naked people running around in this state hospital. The solution was not to clothe them, it was to paint all the windows black. So even in the 1980s, we had these horrific stories. But back in 63, John F. Kennedy said, we're going to change all this. We're going to get people out of these institutions. The discovery of a drug called Thorazine made it possible for taking people with schizophrenia and other serious mental illness out of institutions into the community. And we passed this Community Act, and we said, we're going to fund it. We're going to close down these places. Now, without continuing to go into too much detail, the driving force here was not really compassion, it was money. These places were extremely expensive to operate. And so the states were saying, hey, if the feds will take care of these people, let's let the feds do it. And so they started shutting down these state institutions and putting it over on the feds. Well, we elected Ronald Reagan, and he said, look, we're going to cut the budget. And what got cut? Money for these community services. Now, this was in the 60s and 70s, but what happened during that period is we also had a civil rights movement where we said, okay, people have mental health. Just because you may have a psychotic condition, that doesn't strip you of your rights. You have a right to refuse medication. You have a right for almost a jury trial to depend on whether you be put in one of these. And this combination created a perfect storm where now today we don't have sufficient beds. It's impossible, like in my son's case, to force someone to get help even when they're not thinking clearly. And that's created homelessness and created people going to jails and prisons because there's nowhere else for them.
Yeah.
It's a long explanation, but that's what happened.
It helps us understand we have to look at our history if we're going to understand where we're at right now and what are we going to do to move forward to make this better. I remember you detailing in your book, you were even at a spot where you were so desperate to get your son the help that he needed. And a nurse whispers in your ear, well, if you say he threatened to kill you, if you say that you're in fear for your safety. And I mean, that's the spot that some parents are at, that some family members are at, that they are almost backed into a corner to where if I lie, I'll at least get my my loved one a 72-hour bed to get mentally assessed.
That's
Or
correct. And it's horrible because you have to be prepared to have your kid hate you in order sometimes to get them help. So let me tell you what happened. So after my book is published, publishers like a happy ending, and my book ends with us eating a steak together. And he says, "Don't worry, Dad, everything's going to be fine." Well, it wasn't. For the next 6 years, we went through hell. We had 5 more hospitalizations. But let me tell you what, after the first hospitalization, I thought, I'm smart enough. I've written a book. I can help my son. So he was living with me and he wasn't taking his meds. So I took a legal pad and I said, "Look, on this side is when you're doing well, and on this side is when you're not. Oh, look, this is when you're on your meds." Well, you can't talk logic to an illogical mind. So then I tried bribery. I said, "I'll pay you $50 a week if you take your meds in front of me." And he looked at me and said, "Dad, I'm not a prostitute." Well, then I tried duplicity, and I ground up his medication and I put it in a breakfast cereal and fixed him breakfast. And he came out suspicious. "Well, why are you fixing me cereal?" And I discovered his medicine floated. All the pink chips were up there. And so then he got angry. We had this huge fight. I told him he had to take his meds if he was going to live with me. He demanded to go to my ex-wife's house, got in the car, jumped out of the car while we were driving over there. So that didn't work well. I couldn't handle the situation. His illness was too strong. So then I decided that I needed professional help. So we have a mobile crisis response team with the people who are supposed to come and assess and decide if someone needs to be put in a hospital. So I called it, and the dispatcher said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, wait. Is he dangerous?" Exactly what you're talking about, Chris. I said, "No, he's not dangerous yet, but last time he broke into it." No, you can't judge him on his past acts. "Is he dangerous right now?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Call us when he's dangerous." Well, 2 days later, my ex-wife's locked in the bathroom. She's calling me frantic. I drive over to her house. I go in. Kevin is ranting and raving, and he chases me out of the house like Rocky, tells me to leave. Well, now I call that same dispatcher. And this is what parents go through. I said, "Listen," and by now I knew the magic word. I said, "My son is violent. I need you to come." And the dispatcher said to me, "Is he dangerous or violent?" And I said, because I was worried, would he come or not? I said, "He's violent." "Oh, we don't come if they're violent. Call the police." So the police came. They shot him twice with a taser and took him off. Another opportunity where he could have very easily been shot fatally. Now that made him angry. He's upset. He's just been shot with a taser. I go down to the mental health center. He's lying on his belly with his hands chained behind him, connected to his feet. And I'm looking at that, and the officers are making fun of him, egging him on. And I'm thinking, is this our future? Is this our life? Well, we wait. 4 hours later, I had meanwhile gone in and said, "Can you please unhandcuff him, please, at least let him sit in the chair." 4 hours later, he's calmed down. I know the psychiatrist isn't going to hold him. Now, I'm embarrassed to tell you this, but I went in and I got him all riled up. Why? Because that's the only way I could get him to get the kind of help. It is so harmful to parents. It is so harmful to the person to have them treated that way. Eventually, after 5 hospitalizations, my son woke up and he decided he needed help. The last time, would you like me to tell you about the last time he got sick?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Last time he got sick was Thanksgiving. He knows I can tell he's off his meds, so he jumps in his car and he takes off. He starts driving, and I call and I call and I call, and finally he answers, and I say, "Where are you going, Kevin?" He says, "I'm going to heaven." Well, that's not real reassuring. He ran out of gas in North Carolina. So he calls me, and I said, okay, I'll come get you." "No, Dad, don't come. All right, get some gas." "No, Dad, you don't understand. If I step out of this car, I will die. That's what the voices are telling me. Now, you know that's ridiculous. But if your head is telling you that, you believe it.
Yeah.
So I did what no father should do. I arranged for him to get gas, and he drove psychotic up 95 until he got home 4 hours later. I said, look, I had talked to experts by now, Chris, and they said, don't argue, don't fight, don't try, say you want to be his partner, not his parent. I said, I want to help you. What can we do to work together? He said, Dad, there's a safe house. I want to go in this safe house and just think. I said, great. I drove him to the safe house, checked him in. In the middle of the night, he got up. He took off all his clothes because taking off your clothes makes you invisible. And he went walking out. But listen to what happened this time. This time, a crisis intervention team trained officer saw him and pulled over and said, hey, what are you doing walking midnight naked down the street? Why don't we go over to the emergency room? And Kevin said, don't handcuff me. I'm not a criminal. That's when I got tasered. He said, no problem. He used his discretion, put him in the back seat of a squad car. Then this officer said to him, what kind of music do you like? Oh, I like rap. He turned to a rap station. They listened to rap all the way to the emergency room. When they got there, he said to him, I'm not going to leave you. Sorry.
That's right.
I'm not going to leave you. I get emotional about this. And when that doctor came out and said, I'm not going to admit him because walking naked down the street does not meet imminent danger, the officer actually said to him, oh, Dr. Smith, I'm going to look up where you live and drop him off on your front lawn. Well, Kevin was admitted to the hospital. And then he got a case manager. And she said to him, why don't you like taking meds? Well, I gained weight. I can't drink beer. I'm all sluggish. You know, of my son's 7 psychiatrists, only 2 have ever bothered to learn anything but his name and symptoms. And that is so disrespectful. That is so inhumane because you're a person. You want to be treated like a person, not just a product. She got him a doctor actually listened to him. They found him a med with few side effects. Then she said, you shouldn't live with your father. You're too old. I'm going to get you in a house with 2 guys with schizophrenia. Now, I thought that was ridiculous, but it gave him pride. He was old enough to be on his own. He didn't have to abide by my rules. And then she said, what are you going to do? And he said, oh, what can I do? I have bipolar. Knock it off. Control the illness. Don't let it control you. My son, with a college degree, was the cart boy at Home Depot. He was the guy picking up carts, and he got discouraged. All his friends are moving on. They're getting married. They're having life, promotions. And his therapist saw him and said, man, you're doing great. And he thought she was mocking him, said, no, 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 come to my group. And he went to the group and he talked to people. And he realized he was doing great. But more importantly, he liked it. He liked talking about how he was working toward recovery. And she said, I have the perfect program for you. It's called Peer-to-Peer, a person with mental illness helping someone with mental illness. And he went through the courses. And today he works full-time as a peer-to-peer specialist, a person with mental illness, helping people with mental illness. Let me brag on him. A guy over 300 pounds, schizophrenia in his parents' basement. My son goes over and starts talking to him and meeting with him, eventually gets him out. They go to McDonald's. They go to a movie. Now, that's not a big deal unless that is your son. But I think a key to my son's recovery was, 1, you have to acknowledge that you need help. And 2, he went from being someone who needed help to someone who is helping others.
Yes.
You know, Chris, I get angry. People say, oh, what do people with mental illness want? They want what we all want. They want a safe place to live, people to love, and a purpose in their life. And he got all of that. And today he's doing great. 2 years ago, he got his master's degree and he works full-time, lives independently. So people with mental illness can get better, but you got to give them the tools to get better.
Wow. And I know here in Washington state, we have laws that allow families to petition the court to force their loved one in. Are you aware of how many states have ours is called the Joel's Law. Are you aware of how many states have a law in place that at least gives family members some type of tool to pursue the court to get their families the help that they need, their family members?
Almost all but, I think it's all but 2 states now have assisted outpatient treatment, where if you have a history of going off your medication, of history of getting into trouble, you can have a judge tell you you have to stay in treatment. And that helps get people out of the fog. And there are states where you can get guardianship and get people out of the fog, because one of the arguments is that the first part of your brain to go is the part where you understand that you are ill, that you are clueless. When my son's psychotic, he thought everything was great. He didn't see anything wrong. He thought, when he was manic, um, it is difficult, though, to keep people under any kind of forced treatment for long periods. Um, they have to understand they're ill. So the best is to, even if you have to force someone in treatment, have them recognize that they're ill and they needed help, because people don't like to be forced.
Yeah.
In a long term, it makes it difficult. Luckily, most people, when they are required to take treatment or they get treatment, uh, get help and acknowledge that they need help. Medication, we live in a society that prizes medication, and medications, I've found, generally are the key to helping people get better. But not all medications work with folks. And there are some medications that do harm. And so we have to continually look for better answers. And the key is meeting someone where they are and trying to work with them together to move forward. And that's difficult if someone's psychotic, but most people aren't psychotic 24 hours a day,
Yeah.
and it's a struggle, but you just try to work with people to get them to a place where they want to get better.
Well, Pete, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've heard in your story here is the power of having CIT trained police officers,
Absolutely.
officers who have that training, who have that passion to connect with other human beings and work with them through this mental health crisis. And then the power of having great other medical professionals, in this case, a caseworker that got to know your son, that looked at him as that whole person, and how can we reinstate dignity in his life, give him a little bit of power back, living out on his own, and then moving him into the rest of treatment.
Yep, you've described it perfectly, Chris. That's exactly. It's valuing the person and not seeing the illness as the definition of that person. My son's more than having bipolar disorder.
Yeah. Hey, twice a month, my wife here on the Gravity Podcast hosts Marriage Mondays, and we like to talk about how do we maintain perspective in life. How do we identify our foundations? And we talk about it within the topic of marriage. What was this like for you and your wife, Patty? This is like the ultimate strain as you're trying to walk with your son through this mental illness, but there's all these setbacks. This had to create some stress between you and Patty. How did you guys work through that?
Well, Patty is my second wife. We've been married for 24 years. And I think as Kevin's stepmother, she had a better perspective. I would say, oh, he can't do that. He can't do that. And she'd say, now, wait a minute. You're saying he can't have a checking account, but he is making rap music and putting them on CDs and selling them. So she helped me better define, a hard thing for a parent is enabling. Where do you draw the line between enabling and letting someone fall on their own? And she was very, very good at that. Because we have a blended family of 7, a rule that the blood parent is kind of the one who makes the ultimate decision. But she was so supportive and very wise about helping me. She was more of a therapist to me than kind of a burden. And that was very, very, the hardest thing. Look, you got to understand that these are really cruel diseases. You got to understand that it affects the whole family. My you have other family members, other brothers and sisters who say, why are you spending all your time with Kevin? Why is he's getting special treatment, special attention? So you have to understand that, and then they have to accept it. They wonder, his blood brothers and sister wonder, can this happen to me? And how long has this happened? So those are all the family dynamics. I think the hardest thing, though, for a parent and in this relationship is realizing that ultimately you don't have control. If you ask parents, what do you want for your children? They'll all say, I want them to be happy. But that's the one thing you can't do. You can teach your children good manners. You can teach them to be responsible for money. But you cannot make another person happy. And you also have to understand that you may not be able to save another person.
Wow.
And I looked at my son and I thought, I'll do anything I can to save him, when in fact, that may not be possible. This is a mean illness. And accepting that is something that I struggled with very, very hard. And, my wife helped me see kind of the long picture. She always thought that we could get out of this. And there were times when I didn't.
Yeah.
Because I was seeing people in jails and prisons. I'd put myself in the worst situations, and I tended to go there. Is he going to end up in jail the rest of life, prison the rest of his life? And I've told him this, I even thought at one point, would it have been better he hadn't been born? Well, that underestimated the resilience and the power of him and his ability to find his way forward.
Yeah.
And I'm ashamed of that now, but that's what you go through.
Wow, that's just the reality, though, of being human. I love what you just said there. It reminded me, you talk in your book about some wisdom that Judy Robinson gave you in Miami. She leads one of the NAMI groups, and one of the things that you talk about in the book Crazy is she told you to never give up. This is a nasty disease. It's a cruel disease. Mental health is a cruel disease. There are no promises, but never give up. And you didn't give up.
But I don't blame parents who need to take a break or back off. Every case is different, but no, I couldn't walk away. And Kevin and I have a special bond because of that. It's like being the difference between watching a war movie and actually being in war, being on the battlefield or having someone shooting at you. I mean, I looked at him at a time, and this was a kid, I saw his birth and I didn't recognize him. And, he was hostile and angry. It was a person I didn't know. And one of the things that parents run into that's so irritating is being judged by family members. Oh, you're just babying, you're cuddling. Judged by professionals. Before I was talking to a mental health worker once, before he knew I had a son with mental illness, and he said, oh, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. All you have to do is look at the parents and you'll see why these people have mental problems. And you judge by society, and there's this shame, and I've never felt the shame. I don't think the only shame should be not helping someone with a mental illness. But I've had people say, oh, I liked your book, but I took the cover off when I was on an airplane. I didn't want people seeing me reading about it. People are embarrassed by mental health. And the only way to fight that is by putting a human face on it, and saying, hey,
Yes.
Look, happened to me, happened in my family. I'm not embarrassed by it. And, most people get better. Most people are not violent. That's why I so oppose the waiting till people get violent. I think that's a fool's standard. I think the laws need to be changed in that. I think Hipaa needs to be changed. I have parents who drive their kids to an emergency room and then call the hospital, and they won't even tell them they're in the emergency room. We have to get families part of the recovery. If the families are willing to do it, they should be part of the treatment team. And too often they're looked on as the enemy, someone who caused this problem or is contributing to it.
Yeah.
So, I think that's wrong.
I love what you said there, Pete, about putting a face on it. When I experienced an anxiety disorder and clinical depression, it was the people that had courage to come up to me and tell me a piece of their story
Right.
that made me realize that there was hope. And then a competent counselor and doctor, and then my lovely wife who walked with me through that, allowed my brain to heal. But I don't know, if it wasn't for those folks that had the courage to come up and tell me pieces of their story, I may have been okay still. I still had the great doctor, great counselor, my wife, but I just remember very vividly hearing those stories and me looking at these people and going, if you're okay, if you experience that and you're okay, you know what? I'm going to be okay too. I'm going to have to do a lot of work. I'm going to have to do a lot of work to heal my brain, to manage stress better in the future. And I know this is different than your son's story, but I feel like it's just, when we talk about mental illness and someone being afraid to have your book on a plane, I sit there and think that's part of the problem. We need to reduce the stigma. If I break my leg, I'm not embarrassed that I broke my leg. I might feel stupid for doing, tripping or whatever, but I'm not embarrassed about it. Mental illness, the broad spectrum of it, isn't something to be embarrassed about. It's something for us to approach and heal from.
And you said it so eloquently and so well. And I do think that, when my son tells his story, it offers inspiration to other people who are going through it, because only if you walk down that path do you understand.
Yes.
And that's the power of a peer. That's the power of someone who's been there, gone through it, been down that road and says, I'm there. And I think that he and I have different roles. I think, as speaking as a parent, I think that I get to other parents and they think, wow, if it happened to him, it could happen to me. And he talks to the audience of, people who have been through it and what their experiences are. It's not it's not only stigma, it's wanting to believe there's something wrong with someone who has a mental illness. And the reason is that we abandon people on the street who, most of them have schizophrenia, and we abandon them on the street and we walk by them. And the best way to walk by them and not feel guilty is to say, oh, they're drunks, they're drug addicts. And we know that 40% of people with serious mental illness do have co-occurring disorders, but to blame them. Because if we actually admitted that this is a brain dysfunction, if we actually admitted that it is no different than breaking your leg, then we'd be obligated to help them. So it's easier to go, oh, they deserve that. They want to be that way. They like being homeless, which is all nonsense. But it leaves us, because we don't want to admit that it's a brain problem, because if it is a brain problem, it could happen to us. And we don't want that to happen. So it's easier to say, oh, there's something wrong with them, they're flawed, or they just don't know how to pull themselves up the bootstrap. Because if it happens to them, it could happen to us, and we're scared. And that's the fear that people have.
Well, as an American society, we've gotten better, but we have a lot of work to do still to get this to the spot where we need to be to take care of each other better. Yeah.
And I think the tide has changed. We're long gone from the Psycho movie days to the Silver Lining Playbook, where we understand that people get sick and the brain is no different. And the focus on the brain and brain mapping and trying to understand these things, because the bottom line is, I don't believe anyone gets through life without having some kind of mental crisis. I just don't believe it. I mean, even if it's as all of us lose a loved one, and you have to deal with grief. And how do you deal with grief? That's a mental issue. It's different than schizophrenia. It's environmentally prompted, but it's still a brain issue. It's the most complex. What's the heart? The heart's a muscle. The brain is the most complex part of our body, and we need to recognize that and do what we can to keep it healthy.
Yeah. Hey, Pete, I value your time. Thank you so much for joining me today. You have over 20 books out there. If people want to follow your work, The best way to do that is by just searching PeteEarley.com. Is that correct?
Yeah, www.peteearley.com. I'm pulling back a bit, but I try to do a blog. I used to do it every Monday and Friday. Now I do it whenever the spirit moves me. But yes, there's lots out there, and the most helpful blogs are like written by people who are going through it. I do a lot of first-person stories, and I'll be putting this podcast up on my blog. You've been a great interviewer, so thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. And listeners, go ahead and look down in the comments. There's going to be a link to Pete's website. You got to check him out. I've read 2 of his books already. They were absolute page turners. Check it out today. It's going to help you as you move through life. Pete, once again, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Take care.
Wow, ladies and gentlemen, what a powerful story that Pete had to share with us. And I can only imagine being a dad in his shoes and walking with one of my kids through this. Really tough. I love the story, though, of his perseverance, the fact that he never gave up, even in moments of desperation. Just a powerful story for all of us. If you haven't read his book yet, take a look down in the comments. I'm going to give you the link to his website. You got to check out his website. Just lots of great books that he has authored that can give you perspective in life. Hey, folks, Jaimie and I want to hear from you. We want to get better at doing this whole podcast thing. There's a couple different ways that you can communicate with us. If you're consuming this on YouTube or on Apple or Spotify, you can still rate and review us, give us thumbs ups or thumbs down. If you're on Spotify or Apple, there's a 5-star rating system. We'd really appreciate a 5-star rating if we've earned it, folks. If we haven't earned it, maybe shoot me an email instead at chris@gravityct.com. Let us know how we can make it better, maybe future Marriage Monday topics or guests for me to interview. Folks, we only get to live this life once. Go out to the people in your tribe. Take good care of them. Love on them. Take care. God bless.